As a reminder, this is a webinar and you are automatically muted and your camera is off. So please use the chat and the QA features to leave your comments and questions. In just a moment, I'll add more information about technology contact for me, and if you have any problems, how to solve that. Additionally, the Alumni Association has many virtual events coming up, so I'll provide a link for that for our website in the chat. We'll be sending out a survey, the recording of this webinar, and additional resources. So be on the lookout for that email next week. And now I'm excited to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Charlie Hoxmeier. Charlie is a two-time alum of Colorado State University and the brewmaster of Gilded Goat. Grab your drink, and without further ado, take it away, Charlie.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm happy to be here. Ryan, is there a way that I can be videoed?
Yep, it should be showing you.
Great. Great. So since this is, sorry for the casual nature, this is going to be a tour. We're brewing today. So there's actually things to see. There's a giant mess on the floor and a kettle up there that's full of steaming beer. So sorry if anybody has motion sickness and you have to watch me walk around, but I'm going to give you a tour of the brewery, show you the kind of special beer that we're brewing today. And please, Ryan and I have already talked a few times, and if you guys have questions, it's easier to just ask them and stop, and we can talk about them for a minute. But if given free reign, I can talk about beer and brewing for hours. So we could be here for a long time. I'll try and keep to my schedule and show you what I meant to show you, but a Q&A, casual conversation about beer and brewing, and maybe COVID and business if we have to. That would be fantastic. So I'm going to start by walking through our process and how we make the beer and what things go into it and what equipment we use. You, I'm sure, have all been on tours of breweries and you've seen the giant stainless tanks that are in every brewery. I'm going to try and give those a name today so you kind of know what you're looking at. So to start, this is our grain. We use malted barley, malted rye, oats, wheat, and then we kind of break it down like this. This is an example recipe. So we have our base malt over here, which is where we get most of our fermentable sugars from. And then we have variations of what's called crystal malt or roasted malt. And this is where we get unfermentable sugars, color, and flavor. And then finally, some hops. Down here is a roasted wheat. And this is kind of the basic proportions of almost every brew. So we get most of our sugar from this and most of our flavor and color from this. And we can tweak those percentages depending on what we're making. And also hops, of course. These are very old hops that we're using in our brew today. So normally they look a little bit fresher than that. But so that's the where all the fermentable sugar, flavor, and color comes from in most of the beer. And that's all of this grain. Once we get this grain, in fact, most of it's grown locally. We use a lot of locally grown and malted barley that comes from right down the street in Loveland from Root Shoot Malting that you can see there. So we take all of our grain, we put it in this giant mill, and this mill crushes it up into a really coarse, so not quite as fine as flour, but it's a coarse crush. So we take that coarse crush and it gets sent over the top of our equipment. You can, so this tube, and then it drops down in to our mash tun. And the mash tun is where we extract all the starches that are in that grain. And this is what it looks like inside. These are rakes to help us stir it up. And then this is a false bottom. So there's the real bottom of the tank underneath. This false bottom holds all the grain up and lets us drain the water or the wort at this point through these slots. So in the mash tun, this is where we're taking all of our grain, crushing it up, mixing it in together. And if you've ever taken like a handful of oats or a handful of, maybe not a handful of flour, choke hazard, but a little bit of flour on your tongue. If you keep it in your mouth or chew it up a little bit, it starts to get sweet. So all the enzymes that are in your saliva, amylase, are what we use in the grain to convert the starches that's already in the grain into sugar. And that happens in this tank. So we run all of the malts into this tank, we mix it up with water, particular pH, particular water chemistry to make sure all of this conversion happens. So once we've mashed and we've pulled all of that sugar out, we run it through all of our pumps and process piping into the kettle. And that's what we're doing here now. So the beer that we're making today is called a lambic, and it's a very traditional way that Belgians would make sour beers. So we use really old hops. We use a particular recipe, which is Pilsner malt and raw wheat. And that's kind of just the traditional way that people would always make lambics. Belgians would always make lambics. So same recipe, old hops. We boil in the kettle here with those hops. This one is, is a 3 hour boil to concentrate it down and get particular flavors out of these very old hops that we're using in here. And then once this is done, we send it through this mess of hoses that we have laying out. This isn't a normal brew day for us. This is something special. So we have to send all of this beer that's sitting here in this kettle through all of these hoses all the way out to the front of our space. And I'll walk you out there in a second so you can see it. But this is using a cool ship. So a cool ship is a large rectangular tank that sits outside overnight, and all the natural flora and fauna floating around in the air or snow, which is the case tonight, falls into our hot wort that sits outside in this cool ship overnight. And it's enough yeast and bacteria, because most of these microbes are environmental, it's enough yeast and bacteria that can fully ferment out our beer and make a very nice, complex sour beer. So it's a tricky process. It's kind of a roll of the dice because there's so much biological variability in this process. But when it works out really well. And it's a fun thing to do, exploring the natural microbes that are just colonizing Fort Collins air, I guess. So I'm going to put my mask on and then walk you out to the front so you can see the final step of this process. So we take our beer from the brew house back there over the top of me, and we run those hoses all the way out front to the outside front patio of our space, and then fill that tank up. So that tank holds about 200 gallons. We fill it to the brim. We put a little screen over the top of it, and it sits there all night long until the next morning, and we fill barrels, old wine barrels with it, and let it sit for 1 to 3 years, because it takes that long for all these different bugs to do their thing. So this is just a very cold, wintry night in Fort Collins, but that's how you brew these cool ship beers, using that cool ship. So I'm going to take you back inside now.
Hey, Charlie.
And we can stop walking around. Yeah, Ryan.
Someone was asking, how did you guys deal with the fires and all the ash this summer?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the ash in the air wasn't a huge problem, and we can only do, sorry, maybe easier to hear me now. So we can only brew cool ship beers in the winter. The overnight low needs to be about 20 degrees or less, so 15 to 20 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. And that's the ideal time to do it, because we want a particular rate of cooling. We're filling the cool ship up at 200 degrees Fahrenheit, and we want it to be about 65 degrees the next morning. So the outside temperature, a little bit of wind, we have to get this particular rate of cooling, which means we can only do it in the winter. And the other reason that it's done in the winter is because there's less mold spores and bugs floating around in the air. So enough yeast and bacteria, which means the ash, not a huge deal. The impact that it did have on us is customers didn't want to be out It was masks were still required, of course. So that was a side benefit. Having to wear a mask around was all the ash in the air, but it didn't affect our brewing process at all. The thing that it will affect is when the runoff happens in the spring. So we've dealt with fires, the High Park fire in Fort Collins. I think that was 2008. And that dramatically affected the water quality, and water makes up 90% of my product. So the brewers have a really vested interest in the quality of the watershed, the health of the watershed. Ash in the air, not a huge deal for us, but as soon as it runs off into the Poudre River and hits the water treatment plant, that certainly does affect us. So we work really closely with the water treatment plant here in Fort Collins to help them know when we're affected, when we can tell that there's a difference in our water quality, or potentially what it could do to us and how much water we can use during our process. So great question. But that's the tour of kind of what we're doing here, how we do it, the tanks that we use, and the special beer that we're brewing tonight. If there are particular questions kind of across the board about anything, beer and brewing and business or whatever, I'm happy to talk about it. Otherwise, I can tell you more about the business and what we're doing here. Ryan, anything in particular?
Let's see, we don't have any questions in there right now. Let's see. Let me checking the Q&A section too. Yeah, we don't have any questions there. So one question I had was, who and how does the equipment get maintained? Is it by your staff, or do you have to have someone else come in and sterilize things for all your processes, or is it pretty much in-house?
Yeah, it's in-house, and that's the nature of running a small brewery, is that I wear all the hats. So Christine, yeah, I'll get your question in a second. Maintenance is a big deal. We have a lot of very large, expensive equipment that takes a lot of engineering and plumbing and electrical work to maintain, and that falls on me. But in other breweries, larger breweries, they have a dedicated maintenance staff that can deal with things like that. But it's a lot of maintenance, and brewing is not a glamorous job. Often referred to as glorified janitors, because it's a lot of cleaning. Most of what we do is cleaning because that's what can impact our product the most. So, Christine, can we only do one batch at a time? Technically, yes. So on the brew house, this is the brew house with Shauna. She's controlling the brew right now. So on the brew house, the mash tun and the kettle, we can only make one beer at a time. But then we have multiple tanks. So we can put 2 batches in that one batch in that one batch in that one, and then there's a few more big ones right here. So we have multiple batches going at a time in the brewery, but we can only brew one at a time on the brew house, and that's a good question. There's one more about barrel aging that I saw.
How do you incorporate barrel aging?
That's barrel aging is tricky. There's a price premium, so you can sell barrel aged beers for a higher price point. There's a lot of demand for it, for good barrel aged beers, so there's a reason to do it for sure. For a small brewery, it's risky. We have 60 barrels here, some sour, some not sour. So I like barrel aging a lot. I like kind of that microbial roll of the dice, I guess, using different bugs to drive particular flavors in clean beers and sour beers. So the industry average for most breweries is that they dump 20% of their barrels every year, which is kind of a big chunk for a small brewery. If I only have 60 barrels, that's a tough thing to chew on, to have to dump some of those down the drain. But that's, you have to draw a line for quality, and if it doesn't meet your quality standards, the beer has to go down the drain. It's not worth it to sell subpar beer. So incorporating barrel aging, the beer doesn't care what my plan is for it. So I have to taste these barrels all the time, usually with the rest of my staff, because everybody tastes things a little bit differently. So we taste these barrels all the time, kind of try and find the window of the time that it spends in barrels that it's good, and then pull it out of those barrels and get it on tap, or continue to age it in stainless kegs out of the barrel, or transfer it to a different barrel. So that's kind of the analogy. It's not an analogy. The comparison I like making for brewing is the art and science are two sides of the same coin. We have to do both of these, and barrel aging is definitely the artistic side. There's so much sensory involved in it, blending flavors. So barrel aging is certainly tricky, but it's usually worth the risk in my experience. And the beer that we're making today, our lambic, traditionally that spends 1 to 3 years in old wine barrels, and it really is not good until it can have the amount of time that it needs in barrels to get better. So I see a few more questions rolling.
Yeah, so we had 2 questions related to what's your background and how did you get into this business?
A great question. So my background is in infectious disease, and I did my PhD in microbiology at CSU, and then went to work as a postdoc for the Centers for Disease Control for many years. And the ironic thing is that I'd left the infectious disease world to start a brewery right as an infectious disease closed down my brewery. Not right as, we got 5 years in. So, but it's kind of a rough mix for me now that I'm trying to run a small business, but also as a recovering public health scientist, so this has been an interesting time for us for sure. But all through, I spent 10 or 12 years training to be a scientist, and I was studying mostly yeast and bacteria and not viruses. It's like apples and elephants really, but there's so much science in brewing. And I realized, so I picked up a homebrew kit kind of on a whim because it was a deal, and I've always liked cooking, and it just seemed like a natural fit. And then I got more and more involved in it, and I'm kind of, if I'm going to do something, I'm really going to overdo it. And that's what brewing became. And I always found a reason to buy new equipment, to improve my process, to learn more about what was happening in a particular step. And it just became all consuming for me. And at the end of my postdoc, I was kind of at a position that I either had to move across the country to get back into academia or find another job at a federal research institution. And I was born and raised in Fort Collins, and I like this place a lot. So I wanted to stay here, and I turned my hobby into a job. So ruined the hobby for me, of course, and now I need a new one. But my job is great, and I enjoy this job a lot. But there's a lot of science involved in this, and I think having my background in microbiology has really given us a leg up on a lot of other small breweries.
Great. We had a question, Chris. Unfortunately, I just found out last week that I'm gluten intolerant. Have you thought of trying any gluten-free beers? Is the process the same as regular beer in making it?
Yeah, it's very different, and that's where some small breweries can get into trouble. Not trouble necessarily. So calling something truly gluten-free, and you'll either know this already or going to figure it out, but calling something truly gluten-free means it can only be made with ingredients that never contained gluten. So the only thing that I can make at my brewery for somebody with celiac or gluten intolerance is gluten-reduced beer. And it's very different. Of course, there's still some gluten in it, but we use an enzyme that chews up the gluten to a level that's usually really low, like 5 to 6 parts per million. Under 10 is the FDA requirement to call something gluten-free. So it's not legally or technically, but biologically it's gluten-free, but we can't call it that. So it's technically gluten-reduced. And there are a lot of breweries that are doing that. It helps with the shelf stability, the haziness, and also kind of opens up a new customer who can potentially handle a gluten-reduced beer. So big difference between gluten-free and gluten-reduced, and we would have to clean down to the protein level our entire brew house from start to finish, all the steps that I showed you to make one truly gluten-free beer. So not worth it for us, but Holidaily out of Golden makes some fantastic gluten-free beers, truly gluten-free.
Nice. Dave has a question. Can you give us some hints on dry hopping? I'm not getting the tropical flavors. Do you use pellets or whole hop cones?
So we definitely use pellets. Pellets are more efficient for a brewery of larger commercial size to use. And dry hopping is tricky. There have been a lot of advancements in dry hopping over the last few years as the kind of hazy IPA or those extra fruity IPAs have kind of taken off. So we pulled a lot of our hops out of the whirlpool, which is the stage at the end of brewing where you spin the kettle around to kind of solidify all the protein that's in the kettle, because we don't want to transfer that to the next stage. So we whirlpool the kettle, basically spin all this around, and we can add hops at that stage. But through trial and error and making a lot of different beers, we pulled some of our whirlpool hops out of the whirlpool, and we instead add them to the fermenter as we're filling it up. And that kind of keeps some of the flavors in solution a little bit better, we found. But I would say, if anything, you're probably just not adding enough. And I had that problem as a home brewer too. It's hard to lose a lot of beer if you have a 5-gallon carboy that you're filling up as a fermenter and the bottom third of it is full of just hop gunk. That's, you know, the necessary evil of dry hopping these beers. So I would say probably in general, you need to add more, but I also love talking about this. So if you want to grab my email, more than welcome to keep chatting about that.
You mentioned something about the flavoring. Someone was wondering, do you use actual berries or like a syrup to get that kind of flavoring?
Yeah, so that's a big thing for us, is using natural ingredients, and we try and get a lot of ours from Colorado. So we make a cherry sour, and all of the cherries come from a family-owned farm in Hotchkiss, Colorado. Palisade peaches, of course. We've had some fruits and vegetables. We make a pepper beer, and we get those peppers from the CSU Research Extension down in Rocky Ford. So we try and use natural flavors as much as we possibly can. I think the quality is better, the shelf life is better. It tends to be more expensive and more labor intensive to stem and de-seed 100 pounds of peppers for a beer. It's terrible, but the beer's great, so I have to do it.
And then someone had a question about the barrels, your 60 barrels. Are they on site or are you storing them somewhere else?
Yeah, no, they're on site. They're kind of around the corner through the nefarious double doors. So we keep them in the back of our space. Our space is a little misleading because we have such a small front facade, front storefront, but it goes back a long ways. So we have kind of a space in the back that our canning line lives in. That's where all of our barrels are, our workshop area. So yep, they're all here on site.
Ben says, hey Charlie, hope all is well. Are you still maintaining / finding wild yeast strains?
I sure am. I wonder if that's the Ben I'm thinking of. Was his last name on there?
It is Karjek. I'm butchering it.
Yep, that's him. Yeah. Ben and I were grad students together.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, absolutely. We find a lot of that, and we're doing a sequencing project on the microbes that are coming out of the cool ship. So there's kind of a shotgun approach to looking at what was in there. It was pretty similar to a Belgian paper that was published a few years ago, and they found over 1,000 different species of microbes in the cool ship. So that's kind of what we saw initially, and I don't know how many of them are actually culturable, but we're starting down this road of potentially never-ending project of trying to culture some of these environmental microbes from the cool ship.
Wow. One of the questions is, what is your biggest challenge in running the brewery? Also, congrats on choosing the best mascot, the goat.
Yeah. The people love the goats for sure, and it has alliteration and imagery, so it sticks in your head. A lot of work goes into the brand, the silly branding, but yeah, thank you. Sorry, I got distracted by the goats, of course. What was the first?
The biggest challenge that you face when you're starting to run your brewery.
Oh yeah. So my answer to that question is mostly because I spent so long behind a microscope in labs as a scientist, and the most challenging aspect for me was managing all the people that we need to do this. So it's certainly not a one man show. With Shauna, my assistant brewer, my parents are here all the time. We have a staff of 10 plus or minus that have to sell this beer for me and engage with our customers and stay healthy and happy this whole time. So the management aspect is just something that I had no experience in. So that's been my biggest challenge, but also probably the most rewarding one, that I can see have good people in here that are passionate about what they do, and I can try and give them the things that they need to be good here. So that's it's easy to brew beer. Easy for me to say that now after doing it for a while, but brewing beer is easy. Selling it and keeping a happy house is a whole separate animal.
Someone was wondering, they just took tips training. Do your employees have to take that class?
I think I saw Marty Bachman ask that question.
Yep.
Marty and I go way back. We grew up with her son. Yeah, tips is I think not legally required per the state, but highly recommended. So everybody requires tips. Basically, all of our staff have to do it. And then just to double down on that, it's separate from serving alcohol, but we require all of our staff to take Cicerone training as well. So yes, a lot of training involved.
We got a question about what state, city, county public policy changes would be the best for breweries?
Oh man, that's a loaded question. I don't even know where to start with that. So they've changed the rules on us, and I say us as like the collective small restaurant, small brewery. The bars and restaurants have had even maybe a more difficult time than breweries in some municipalities. So we're all just trying to play along is not the right word. We want to keep everybody healthy. We don't want to contribute any additional infections. Of course, I think every bar and brewery and restaurant that I've been to in the last year, they've been working their butts off trying to maintain compliance because they realize the greater good for it. You know, it's hard because not everybody's playing by the same rules. And, you know, it's hard for me to not get on my soapbox about this, running a small business during this time either, but nobody's playing by the same rules. You can drive an hour up the road to Wyoming and it's not even a thing. So there's a lot of frustration, but also there's some light at the end of the tunnel. Colorado's been pretty aggressive with their vaccination program. The vaccines seem to be fairly effective. So that's what we're looking forward to, is kind of a relaxation in the restrictions based on some threshold of vaccines. And outside of that, I don't really see that there's any one thing that state, local, or federal government could do that's going to change this game for us. As much as I like the no, I'm gonna stick with that answer.
Yeah, don't get yourself in trouble. Someone was asking, they didn't see any hazies on the menu. Are you considered producing any?
Oh, it's because we ran out of 2 of them yesterday. So yeah, I hope to. There's probably an IPA or 2 IPAs in my tanks all the time. And I'm not even an IPA drinker, so such is the nature of running a brewery. Is now I have to make what pays the bills instead of what I like to drink all the time. So we definitely have hazies. I don't necessarily bill them as a hazy, more of what the flavor descriptors are, because I kind of prefer that description of it. But we have them, and you just caught us. You caught us at a bad time because they move so fast, and I can't brew them enough to always have them on.
So what is the beer you're enjoying the most right now?
The beer that I drink at my brewery the most is called Lightfoot. It's our coffee pale ale. And the coffee is a Ethiopian variety that's roasted, custom roast by Jonathan, who owns Harbinger Coffee, which is another locally owned coffee shop here in Fort Collins. So I sat down with Jonathan and we tasted a bunch of different coffees and different roasts with a similar version of this beer. And in fact, that's what I have right now. So I wanted, a lot of times when people think of coffee beer, they think Folgers or dark, roasty, burnt. It can be pretty harsh, or it's in a dark beer. So I was pretty interested in pairing the coffee with the hops that we use, and that's El Dorado hops, which are kind of citrusy, floral, orange flavor. And the coffee that I wanted you to know that it was coffee, but I didn't want it to taste burnt or overly roasted or over extracted. So it was it was a fun exercise to find the type of coffee and then the level of roast that complemented the kind of the sweet maltiness that we have. You can see it's not a dark, heavy beer. It's fairly light, fairly low ABV. And the coffee complements the other flavors. It's not the only flavor, it's one of the flavors, which was important to me. So coffee pale ale is what I'm usually drinking. And if I'm not at my brewery, because I have to drink my beer professionally, it's usually really dry red wine or Kentucky bourbon.
And then would you consider that your most proud beer to make, or what's your favorite specialty beer that you have?
My favorite, I think I have to say, our German Bock. So Bock is a very traditional malty German lager, one of the beers that I've been home brewing probably the longest. I just like the really malt forward traditional beers, that beer flavored beer, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. But I've been brewing it the longest at home. It was the first beer that we brewed here at the brewery when we got our brew house set up. And then we won a gold medal for that beer at GABF, which is kind of the end all be all for a lot of brewers. Is a gold medal at GABF, and you can put your feet up and relax. So
Congrats.
not even close to that, but yeah, it was a lot of validation to have that medal and that recognition for sure. So that beer is one of our best sellers, despite not many people knowing what a Bock is. But if you see a Bock, try a Bock. It's worth a try.
Yeah, someone just asked, is that one of your most popular beers, or what is your biggest one at the tap room? It's always...
It is. So we have a couple of beers that are bill payers, things that I just have to make all the time. IPA, of course, Noku. A light beer that's usually our Pilsner or cream ale. Frumpy Moo is our breakfast stout. We put coffee, chocolate, and vanilla in a dark, thick, heavy stout. Bock is kind of the amber red, malty German lager. So, and then one of our sours called Citrus Sour. It's like, we call it a gateway sour. It's just light and lemony. It's not melt your palate off sour. We have a few of those too, in case that's your thing. But those four beers are the ones that I have to make all the time, are best-selling beers, and Bock got there eventually. So Bock is kind of a tough sell because not many people know what a Bock is, just based on the description of the style alone. But because the beer got a lot of recognition, people started to try it and they liked it, and now it's one of our best sellers. So it didn't start that way, but now certainly.
Going back to your barrels, do you have to temperature control that facility, or can they fluctuate too much or too little, or like cause problems?
Yeah, the fluctuation isn't a big deal. It's the average holding temp that you have to be most concerned about. And that also applies to beer that you're buying from a grocery store or a liquor store. The action of hot to cold repeatedly, not a big deal. It's how long it stays hot is the problem. So we definitely try and manage that with the barrels. Try to keep them fairly consistently low temperature, and that's like 50 to 65 degrees is what we're looking for with that. And that should also be, if you bought a beer to age, that's kind of where you should keep it. So yeah.
Someone was wondering, how did you come up with the name Gilded Goat?
Yeah, that's the family business side of this. So we all somehow we all like each other still, even after running this family business. But we all piled into a motorhome and toured the continental Europe for a few months, bars and breweries and pubs, and we saw a lot of places that had animal themed names to them, and we kind of like that imagery behind it. And then we picked the goat because it's a good representation of Colorado, kind of our bold, adventurous, outdoorsy lifestyle. Gilded with an I, G-U-I, gilded with a U means castrated goat. So we usually clarify that it's gilded, which is golden, a golden goat. And that's kind of the golden shine, the warm woods that we use. And imagery, alliteration, there's a lot that goes into picking the brand. And we had a lot of really bad names as options that I'm not going to mention because they don't matter anymore.
That's so funny. Someone was wondering, could you elaborate more on the quality control processes you guys use?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a lot of sensory. I'm going to take a little tour again. There's a lot of sensory involved in all of that, but because I'm a microbiologist, I have a laboratory. And in this laboratory, we have a biosafety hood, so we can do contamination checks, culture our own yeast. We keep supplies, stocks of yeast samples from all over the place. A microscope, so we can look at the health of our yeast. Yeast is the one product that's not optional. We don't have to use barley, we don't have to use hops. We always have to use a microbe to finish our product. Bacteria, yeast, whatever. So this is the only thing that we absolutely do need. And then we do collaborations with some local companies, and this is a test kit that we're testing for VDK, which is vicinal diketones, otherwise known as diacetyl. And diacetyl tastes like butter or butterscotch. And it's rampant, and people are really sensitive to that flavor. So we do this test, which is kind of a colorimetric assay. It gives us the intensity of the purple color that develops during the test, tells us how much diacetyl is in our beer, and we can just wait and give it some more time for the yeast to clean that up. And then that color will decrease in intensity, and we know the diacetyl is gone. So there's a lot of things that we can do to look at the health of our yeast. That's our primary focus. A lot of the tests involved require a gas chromatograph or a GCMS mass spectrometry. So I'm trying to do whatever I can to find more expensive, more sensitive analytical equipment. But there are a lot of things that we can do just in a small brewery in-house for QC and QA.
And then do you guys distribute throughout Colorado, or is it just Fort Collins?
Yeah, very little distribution actually. And if there were two main categories of brewery, it would be taproom model and distribution model. And COVID has pushed a lot of taproom breweries into distribution, whether they wanted to or not. It was kind of the only way of surviving the shutdown. But we do very little distribution because it's hard for us to brew enough to keep the taproom supplied. So with additional tanks or a larger brew house or something like that, we could end up sending beer out. There's also a marketing benefit. Somebody sees your beer at a brewery down the road or at a bar down the road, and then that brings them in because they want to try what else you make. So there's kind of this intangible benefit to sending beer out. We're just not really set up to do a lot of that.
Someone was wondering, what is the initial investment in dollars to get a brewery off the ground?
I'm not going to tell you. What I will tell you is that if you want $1 million in the brewing industry, you need to start with 2 and spend half of it. It's not a money making gig at all. mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineering that goes into a brewery build out is insanely expensive. Our electrician was our highest paid subcontractor out of all of the builders on our whole site. So it's a very expensive operation to get going, especially if you put some additional time and effort and money, of course, into the finish of your space. And we saw a lot of spaces that were concrete floors and corrugated metal ceilings, and we just didn't want that. Nothing against those breweries, they have fantastic beer, but we didn't want that feel. So we spent a lot of money on the atmosphere of our place, and that was important to us. So can't tell you how what the all-in investment was. Suffice to say, it was substantial.
And have you guys ever created something like an English bitter?
I love bitters. Yeah, absolutely love bitters. That's probably my favorite beer. There's another odd style called a Kentucky Common that I love. It's 2.5% ABV, dark and roasty. But it turns out if you put bitter in the name of a beer, nobody's going to buy it. So an English bitter is also kind of like an English pale ale, which definitely sells better. It might be the same beer, but it definitely sells better. So I like ESBs a lot. Breckenridge Brewery used to make an ESB that they aged in bourbon barrels called Well Built. They don't make it anymore, but it was amazing beer. I would love to make an ESB or just a bitter. It's just not going to move. And that's what I'm up against right now, unfortunately.
Looks like we got Dave out in Pennsylvania. He's wondering, do you ship to private residency? Pennsylvania has relaxed some of their rules on that.
Yeah, Dave, unfortunately, Colorado hasn't, and we are not licensed to ship out of state. You have to make a trip.
If you had to age beers for years, how do you decide what quantity to brew at a time?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we can only brew what our brew house will let us brew. So we have a 7-barrel brew house, which means that's 220 gallons of beer at a time. And it takes 6 hours to make 5 gallons of beer, and it takes 6 hours to make 200 gallons of beer. So I make 200 every time. It just, I have my little homebrew pilot system is in the back of our space. And as romantic as it sounds to try out test batches on my little homebrew system, I'm just not going to spend 6 hours making 5 gallons of beer. So we make 200 every time. And if we're making a batch of beer that could potentially age well, and there are a few factors that you should consider when you're aging something. I'll talk about those in a sec. But if we're making something that could potentially age well, we might try and find a barrel to put it in. We could put it in kegs and put it in our cellar that maintains a cold temperature, pretty steady cold temperature, and just let it sit in kegs for a while and see what happens to it. For the most part, we're brewing a beer with the intention of aging all of it. There aren't many times that we would take like half of a batch and put it on tap and take the other half and put it in barrels. I'll take that back right away because we did that 2 weeks ago. We got some freshly emptied Old Elk barrels from a distillery here in Fort Collins, and we made a double batch of cream ale, and we put half the batch of cream ale into those freshly emptied Old Elk barrels to age for a little while. So, kind of just depends on if we have a vessel to age it in, I guess is the short answer to that.
You mentioned working with distilleries and other coffee shops. Is there any other microbreweries that you work with in Fort Collins?
All of them. And that's the crazy thing about this industry is that we're all fighting for the same customers. And and talking to my other friends too, like I've never heard of an industry that's so competitive like this, but also so collaborative. I hang out with the other brewers in town almost weekly. We share ideas for beers and tips and tricks on techniques and methods, and the camaraderie and the collaboration in the whole industry across the state. And it's probably, Fort Collins is a special little beer place, and I don't know if this applies. It probably is more cutthroat in other areas of the country, but everybody here works together all the time. We share ingredients, we share all kinds of things, and then we hang out and drink each other's beer on the weekends. So it's very strange to be doing that, but also fighting for the same customers.
Well, that's all the questions we had in the chat and the Q&A. Does anybody else have any questions for Charlie? We'll give it a little second here just to see if anything else trickles in. Well, with COVID going on right now, Charlie, how many people can come in and if they want to get some brews with you?
Yeah, Larimer County's at 50% capacity right now. So we can fit about 54, 52 or 54 people in the brewery right now. I don't know what the timeline looks like on moving to a different level of restriction, but right now we're at 50%. So not often turning people away, but Christine, we absolutely sell packaged beer to go. So you don't have to wait around for a place. We do curbside too. If you want to place an order online, we'll bring it right out to you. So the long story medium answer to that question is beer to go is what has got us through this last year, and our community and our customers supporting small business and CSU alum. And so to go beer, yes, please come get some to go beer.
Perfect. Well, I think that's all we got for questions. Let me check the Q&A real quick again. Yep, we answered all of those. Well, I just want to say thank you so much, Charlie, for giving us a tour. That was really enjoyable. I need to get up there. I'm in Denver. I need to get up there and get some of those, like the coffee brew. That sounds so good. But yeah, if anybody is in town in Fort Collins, give them a visit. They got some great stuff up there. And thank you all for attending, and Charlie for giving us a great inside tour of your facilities.
Of course, happy to. Thank you so much. And if anybody comes in, tell somebody behind the bar that you're looking for me. I'll show you around. We can talk Ram football or the lack of Ram football. So thank you so much. Happy to be here.
Perfect. Well, thanks again, everybody, and you take care.